Okay. All right, it's on. It's on. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing? Buenas noches. Bienvenidos. My name is Ray Andrade. I am the programming librarian here at Loyola Marymount University. I am also an alumnus of LMU who's now serving as a programming librarian, and I also serve as a Chicano Studies liaison librarian. So there's a close connection between tonight's speaker and myself. So for tonight, we're going to be featuring Dr. Karen Mary Davalos from Chicano Studies. She's going to be talking about her upcoming publication called Chicano Art from the 60s, From Errata to Remix. So before we actually get started with the formal part of the program, I did want to point out a few things. So firstly, there are some feedback forms that our dean is going to be modeling for you. So those small feedback forms, if you fill them out and please let us know how the outreach team is doing, we would really appreciate that. But also, if you could use a $100 Amazon gift card, you just supply your email address and you're automatically entered into a raffle to hopefully get that gift card. Okay, it might help out. It might help out with a couple of books. All right. So that feedback form, if you could be so kind to submit it into the plastic box to the left of the big television screen, we would really appreciate that. Something else to clarify about Faculty Pub Night. So Faculty Pub Night is not faculty only, okay? So please spread the word and add any clarification to any students who are confused by that. And also, it is a pub night, but it is not 21 and over. Yes, there's booze and wine and stuff like that at the bar. Hey, Eric, how you doing? Eric could help fulfill your demands for that. But it's not 21 and over, okay? So it's an easy place to get some booze and drinks and cheese and crackers and all that, right? Right. Okay. Just declare. Thank you, Carol. That's Carol Raby, one of our outreach team members. All right. So now I'm actually going to be formally introducing tonight's speaker for you. So it is my pleasure to introduce her because she is my former professor as well. So this should be interesting. It's a pretty chunky CV, Karen. All right, so tonight's speaker got her PhD from Yale University, and it focused on cultural anthropology, as she did focus during her master's and her bachelor's, both of which she got at Stanford University. So her career at LMU began almost just shy of 20 years ago. So most of that time she did serve as the chair of Chicano Studies. Now she's serving as the library liaison, so we have a lot of contact regarding library stuff, including tonight's event. So Karen does have a number of publications that have already been out there, so she does have a few books that you could read that are available here at the library as well. So she published a manuscript on Yolanda Emel Lopez. She also published the Mexican Museum of San Francisco Papers, and also Exhibiting Mestizaje, Mexican-American Museums in the Diaspora. She also has a number of edited works and journal editorship, so she's been a co-editor for Aslan, the Journal of Chicano Studies. In progress currently is a multi-volume book and database for Chicano art since 1848. I'm eager to see that, Karen. All right. So we would be here all night if we got into the listing of all of her articles. So there's too many articles to list. So, and I want to give you as much time as possible to talk about your presentation tonight. So she's been invited to many different conferences, including keynote addresses at various conferences such as the U.S.-Mexico Borderland Symposium in Texas. She's been at the Roundtable on Latina Feminism that took place at John Carroll University in Cleveland. And also she was the keynote speaker at one of the annual meetings for the National Association for Chicano Studies. Along with that, she has, again, a long list of honors that I'm not going to go through because we'll be here all night again. But she has been recognized by the Women's Caucus for the Arts, and she received the President's Award for Art and Activism. Along with that, she also received the International Latino Books Award, one runner-up, back in 2011. And back in 2009, you also got recognized again by the International Latino Book Award. And by the National Association for Chicano Studies. So there's a lot of recognitions, too many to list again. And again, your grants were too many, so many grants to list, but one that I did want to note was actually connected to an art workshop that we had today in the library's lobby. So very recently, Karen and myself, and actually team members from Chicano Latino Student Services, who I know are in attendance today, we recently worked on a grant that was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Library Association. So that grant money, it allowed us to to be a part of the national programming that took place in honor of a documentary series called Latino Americans, 500 Years of History. So last fall, we screened 4 documentary screenings, 3 at a public library, 1 here at LMU. And in the spring, we had actually 2 events in the same day. So just prior to this event tonight, we had the Self-Help Graphics Barrio Mobile Art Workshop that took place in the lobby, and you could see some of the finished products from that workshop up on the counter up there. So if any of you were there, you know how much fun that could have been, how much fun that was, actually. So let me move along here, get you some more time, Karen. So in looking at your CV, this is going to begin to wrap it up. Long CV, but actually there's one part of your CV that really caught my attention that's my favorite part. So there's a part of Karen's CV where she talks about how she's mentored students into professional and academic programs beyond LMU. And as your former student, I could personally testify to how much of a mentor and an example you've been for many of us. And I'm sure that you've been a mentor and an example to me much, much more than you imagine. So it's really my honor to have gone from being your former student to now being a professional librarian working with you. So thank you, Karen, for all of your service so far. So can everybody please help me welcome Dr. Karen Mary Davalos.
Thank you, Ray. That was a very sweet introduction. I'm going to just lower this a bit. There we go. Such an honor to be introduced by a former student who's had such a successful career launching from LMU. One dark night. I've always wanted to start a talk like that. One dark night in 1972, 3 artists of the collective OSCO signed their names to the entrance of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And I'm guessing it's that one. Yeah. Spray paint LACMA was a response to the county museum curator's dismissive statement that Chicano artists made graffiti, not art, and hence the reason for their absence in the gallery halls. In other words, Chicano art was a categorical impossibility. As scholars have observed, by signing their names to the museum, OSCO performed a major conceptual remaking and remixing of LACMA. The museum itself was their work of art, a Chicano art object. This performance and the photograph that documents it served to introduce the 2 new concepts that I develop in my book, Chicana, Chicano Art Since the 60s, From Errata to Remix. The signatures of Harry Gamboa, Gronk, and Willie Heron function as an errata to the museum. Something was left out of the collection, and now the error has been corrected. Not only does Chicano art exist, it encompasses the entire museum. The photograph also remixes the gender politics of the group. Patsy Valdez, the 4th member of the original collective, joined in the conceptual project when she was photographed early in the morning before the signatures were whitewashed by the museum staff, adding her presence to the Errata project. Group authorship trumped the gender norms that played out during the night before when 3 OSCO members thought it best not to invite Valdez. Chicana, Chicano Art Since the 60s documents and analyzes works, artists, experiences, and practices that have been overlooked due to prevailing theoretical conventions and disciplinary boundaries. Using vernacular concepts that emerge from the work itself, I put these conventions aside to investigate anew multiple arenas in which Chicano art is produced and interpreted. This research presents a panorama of Chicana, Chicano art since 1963 that includes exhibitions, institutions, private collections, and artist experiences, as well as curatorial discourse and critical art criticism. I demonstrate how each of these topics functions as an important site of knowledge, aesthetic, and cultural production. Now, the book is based on over 10 years of co-participatory research that is complemented by archival research and 17 oral history interviews that I conducted with Chicano artists in LA. These life history interviews produced, on average, 10 hours per artist. And from these interviews, this is just one sample, I was certain that everything I thought I knew about Chicano art was wrong. You see, Chicano art history, the criticism, is something like a unicorn. It's rarely seen, and it might even be a myth. Now, I make this claim not to disparage my colleagues in the work that we've done for the past 40 years, but to emphasize that Chicano scholarship has not kept pace with the artists. More critically, Chicano art history is largely found in the venue of exhibition catalogs, which are not the best location for witnessing or debating the state of the field. Currently, we have 8 books on Chicano art. 2 focus on exhibitions and museum practices. 2 are about Chicana art and political and spiritual meanings. 2 document and analyze Chicano murals. And 2 recently published books rehash old frameworks. A comprehensive and systematic analysis of Chicana and Chicano art does not yet exist. As a result, the field is extremely misunderstood. Add to this dilemma the growing distaste for ethnic-specific art or identity-based anything. Scholars have yet to unearth the rich and complex archive, but they claim, or we claim, that we know where we've been and where Chicano art is going. Now, because this is the first book to look at Chicano art from the 60s through the first decade of the 21st century, and because it accounts for the processes and practices across the so-called political versus commercial phases of Chicana and Chicano art, I'm able to interrogate the assumptions about art during and after the Chicano movement, using an interdisciplinary method that combines formalism, the way in which artists describe the work for its line, composition, and color, etc., with socio-historical analysis, the methodology that Chicano studies scholars have been using. The book maneuvers and intertwines the methodologies of art history and Chicano studies with feminist thought. The chapters in this wide-ranging study each offer new material and ways of thinking about Chicano art. For example, in the second chapter, I document the Errata Exhibition, a term that I have coined to describe a type of visual art practice that challenges interpretations made by the so-called public museum and offers critical engagement with mainstream art institutions. I argue that given the relative absence of Chicano art within American art criticism and authorizing institutions, since 1975, the Errata Exhibition has become a powerful form of intervention. As a critical strategy, the Errata Exhibition announces problematic interpretations, or more accurately, recognizes systematic flaws in the art historical method that do not allow for an accounting of its own coloniality. This coloniality is reflected in part in the dichotomous approach that considers art production as either high or low, fine or folk, modern or primitive, post-ethnic or ethnic. And the placement of my hand is deliberate, right? Something is above the other. As a public critique, the Errata Exhibition holds the potential to rectify myths of whiteness as well as untenable representations of Chicano art and culture, such as those that separate art and politics. In this way, the Errata Exhibition is a social space of opposition and activity that invites public discussion among multiple audiences. Although the insights produced by the Errata Exhibition are related to earlier forms of institutional critique created by Fluxus artists during the 1960s and 70s, as well as the challenges that artists made to the white cube, right? The typical white-walled gallery and its distance from politics in the 1970s and 80s, the Errata Exhibition is concerned most directly with the ideological apparatus of the museum and its creation of visual regimes that support cultural, racial, gender, class, and other hierarchies. The Errata Exhibition works within the dissent tradition of American arts, but with an attention to the aesthetics and the politics that emerge from the very topics usually disallowed in the museum, such as race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, or white privilege. And the example I bring to you is from LMU. The 1990 exhibition, Image and Identity, Recent Chicana Art from La Reina del Pueblo de Los Ángeles de la Porciúncula, was a response to several group shows. Each had been noted in its time as seminal and vanguard, and each eventually came to be treated as a sacred cow. Image and Identity, curated by Sybil Venegas and presented at the Laban Art Gallery, repaired the gender imbalance of 4 exhibitions. It's this social convergence of masculine privilege, not the specific male-female ratios of each exhibition, that inspired the Errata Exhibition at Loyola Marymount University. Venegas was determined to address the narrow representation of Chicana and Chicano art in these 4 influential exhibitions. Image and Identity filled the aesthetic gaps by presenting alternative works by 5 artists who represented in these shows. Venegas selected Laura Aguilar, Barbara Carrasco, Diane Gamboa, Margaret Garcia, and Dolores Guerrero Cruz. Her show documented the range of issues with which Chicana artists were engaged. As Sherry Moraga has observed about the Cata exhibition, what was missing in Cata was the rage and revenge of women, the recognition that the violence of racism and misogyny has distorted our views of ourselves. What was missing was a portrait of sexuality for men and women, independent of motherhood and machismo, images of the male body as violador and vulnerable, and as the female body as the site of women-centered desire. Venegas aimed to rectify those gaps. The work of Diane Gamboa conveys that rage and revenge of women, particularly in Bloody Coffee, in which a woman's retaliation and healing from a man's infidelity merge. Gamboa visualizes her recipe for a successful relationship. 1 drop of menstrual blood will guarantee his monogamy. Barbara Carrasco addresses the internalized oppression within Mexican-American communities and serves as rich evidence of the ways in which Chicana artists expanded the themes and styles that were registered in the 4 seminal exhibitions. Milk the Pass comments on skin color preferences in the United States and within Chicano communities, as well as the artist's personal history. The surrealistic paintings suggest a neatly assimilating Mexican-American household through a strategically placed, larger-than-life chili on top of a red and white checkered tablecloth. The table is the platform for the artist's central image, a white female figure who is gasping for breath as she struggles to free herself from a huge milk bottle. The milk bottle is uncannily alive and animated, and it seems to have swallowed the female figure, whose arms and body are trapped inside the vessel. The woman, entirely white and dripping with milk, has been submerged in the liquid, and the shallow space of the scene dramatizes the woman's struggle to break free of the bottle. The sunny yellow curtains that frame the composition belie the distress of the woman and suggest the secret. Trauma originates in the home. The backdrop also emphasizes this secret, as you see the silhouettes of cockroaches, suggesting the dirty secret of internalized racism and skin colorism within Mexican-American households. Carrasco conveys the unfortunate reality for people of color in the United States who are told explicitly and implicitly to pass for white, as if the denial of self will guarantee success and inclusion. But as we learn, passing requires a total submersion that washes away all cultural identity, community affiliation, and historical memory. As Milk the Pass implies, some of this pressure comes from inside Chicano families. Carrasco's pain, however, also came from her ability to appear white in a group of non-Chicanos who felt safe in publicly deriding and disparaging Mexican Americans when they thought none were present to hear their racist comments. Image and Identity demonstrates how the Errata exhibitions of Chicana feminists advance a critical commentary about Chicano cultural politics, such as patriarchal gender expectations, skin color privilege, and heteronormativity. Venegas intervened against Chicano art criticism using an expansive curatorial strategy, working from a feminist orientation that understands the complexities of multiple subject positions, including gender, race, ethnicity, skin color, language, class, and sexuality, and the co-determined processes of these subjectivities. Venegas describes the work as, quote, primarily representational, often overtly political, yet at the same time intensely personal, revealing, and honest, end quote. Venegas presented no contradiction in joining the two sites of struggle, political and personal. This Chicana feminist paradigm of bridging seemingly disparate spaces, systems, and processes has become the most significant contribution to 20th century criticism, particularly Chicano studies. Chapter 3 travels into uncharted territory regarding Chicano arts organizations. I return to the archive and bring new or previously ignored information to the forefront. Focusing on the period 1969 to 1978, the period of the Chicano movement, the chapter illustrates how the earliest ventures operated with complex and nuanced views about commerce, politics, community, and the arts. The chapter documents how Goes Art Studios and Gallery and Mexicano Art Center move between for-profit and non-profit endeavors, linking commerce and art, engaging in cross-cultural collaboration, and advocating for social transformation and the potentiality of Chicana and Chicano art and the communities from which it emerged. Returning to the archive was essential because of decades of erasure. Admittedly, I participated in that erasure. While working on my first book, I learned about Goes, and I dismissed it from my investigation because it was a commercial enterprise, which in my mind disqualified it from the body politic of Chicano studies. Other scholars reinforced this perspective when they relegated Goes to a few sentences in their art historical accounts, briefly describing the arts institution as commercial or as a for-profit gallery. This silence in the archive and in the scholarship implies that the institution diverged from Chicano cultural politics and the discourse of self-determination. A similar bias appears for Mexicano. Although it's generally celebrated as the counterpoint to the for-profit Goes studio, Mexicano was largely a commercial venture during its first year, and this period receives very little attention by scholars. A closer look, however, shows that Mexicano continued its collaborations with commercial institutions well after it relocated to Mexican-American neighborhoods and named itself a non-for-profit arts center. My exploration of Goes and Mexicano reveals that ideological complexities that are typically associated with activism and art after the Chicano movement were at play during the Chicano movement. Chapter 4 also takes the reader to unmapped territory by analyzing the international influences that inform the work of Chicana and Chicano artists. Very little has been written about the impact of non-Chicano, non-Mexican aesthetics on the work produced by Chicano artists. In general, researchers overlook European art influence and aesthetics. For example, during an oral history interviews for the Smithsonian Institution, Jeffrey Rangel disregards Gilbert Magoo Sanchez Lujan's remark that he was stationed for 3 years in England. Magoo states that he joined the Air Force specifically because the GI Bill would allow him to go overseas and see the world. But then Rangel immediately changes the subjects and says, "What'd you do when you got back?" These grand trips taken by several Los Angeles-based Chicano artists, including Chaz Bojorquez, David Boteo, Eduardo Carrillo, Ernesto de la Loza, Roberto Tito Delgado, Johnny Gonzalez, Leo Limon, Magoo, and Linda Vallejo, are not exactly like the grand tours that earlier explorers had engaged on in earlier centuries. These artists were not trying to establish their social authority or political power. They embarked on grand tours of Europe and beyond because they valued seeing art in person. It was a pedagogical tool. And this pedagogical impulse to discern the tangible components of European art influenced how Chicana and Chicano artists approached their work back home in Los Angeles. Their grand tours provided opportunities to make penetrating artistic observations, and their ventures throughout Europe and beyond informed their philosophical outlook, deepened their artistic commitment, influenced their style and composition, enhanced their technique, and solidified their approach to art. By taking up a topic that had been dismissed since the earliest formations of Chicano art history, I argue that any analysis of Chicano art must recognize the social proprioception of the artist. This attentiveness to art in relation produces a new language and framework for comprehending the realities of aesthetic influences while acknowledging the politics of visibility. And so here what I'm trying to get at is I recognize the risk of describing Chicano art in a European American framework or a European aesthetic framework. It can easily then be read as a contributory approach that erases their own distinction. So I understand the risk of saying, oh, look, Chicano artists assimilate too. So I end that chapter with a very clear argument about the politics of visibility. What I want to share with you today is one example of an artist who went to Europe. And I start with Leo Limon, because Leo Limon's foray to see European art is an excellent introduction since it illustrates the theme that's common among many of the artists that I interviewed. Born in 1952 in Boyle Heights, Limon was immersed in the cultural politics of the Chicano movement and participated in the development of the Chicano Image Bank. He was a student at Lincoln High School, where Sal Castro, the educator and activist known for his leadership during the East Los Angeles student walkouts in 1968, was his guidance counselor. In high school, Limon attended Mecha meetings, enrolled in the first courses to offer Chicano studies curricula, and contributed a poster of Emiliano Zapata for the walkouts at Lincoln High School. Although he'd been tracked into blue-collar careers and was taking shop classes, an art instructor recognized Limon's artistic talent and encouraged him to enter a contest for weekend classes at Otis College Arts and Design. He won. At Otis, Limon studied with Charles White, taking courses in design, advertising, life drawing, and art history. Before Limon's high school graduation in 1971, his friend Frank Hernandez introduced him to Mexicano Art Center and later to Self-Help Graphics, the arts organization that helped us this afternoon. Carlos Almaraz suggested that Limon consider illustration, since he was already reading books about New Yorker cartoonist Sal Steinberg. Limon pursued this career in the early 1970s, landing a job as an illustrator for the interior pages of the Frank Zappa songbook and creating the Cholo for Zappa's 1972 album, Just Another Band from L.A. He also found work at El Malcriado, the UFW newspaper, when he followed Almaraz to Delano, California. Nevertheless, Limon did not decide on a career in the arts. It wasn't until he was stationed in Frankfurt, Germany, and witnessed the integration of art in everyday life did he make that choice. It was his European tour that solidified his personal investment in art and in art in public places and in art for the people. Now, Limon realized during his high school years that he enjoyed the visual arts, but he was not satisfied with studying reproductions. And so while he was at one of those Otis classes, he vowed to himself, I'm going to see it face first. I'm going to see it in Europe. And when he enlisted for the military in 1973, he requested to be an illustrator. Well, instead the Army offered him photography, but he knew it would guarantee where I'd be stationed. Based initially in New Jersey, he took every chance to visit museums in Atlantic City, New York City, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. And when he was sent to a small town outside of Frankfurt, Germany, he explored the medieval and Gothic architecture of that city. He was drawn to the ornate buildings, particularly the gabled houses in the Romenberg, but not to the Bauhaus architecture and its disdain for decoration. When he ventured into museums, he discovered that he'd seen it in the books. And these observations helped him articulate a critique of Eurocentric focus in art history curriculum and in the United States. It was the displays of sacred Mesoamerican artifacts in European museums, as well as the anti-imperialist graffiti that he saw in the streets, that inspired in him a profound attention to decolonial imaginaries. He was determined to return home and study native cultures in order to incorporate an indigenous aesthetic into his arts. Limon was also deeply impressed by European public spaces and the ways in which art was fully integrated into the social milieu. He transplanted to Los Angeles this spatial, historical, and social approach to art. Indeed, for many artists, the Grand Tour solidified their career commitment to work in the arts and to advocate for an art for the people. It was their penetrating artistic observations in Europe and beyond, rather than the Chicano movement, that primarily motivated them to champion public art and endorse the relationship between art and life. While in Germany, Leo Limon developed the conviction that there is no art outside of history, culture, and identity. This point is worth restating. Whereas the Chicano movement offered a political context and motivation for artistic expression in the name of social transformation, liberation, and equality, traveling abroad, for some, an experience that preceded the spark of the Chicano movement, it reinforced the decision to become artists and produce public works of art or art for the people. Their approach to art was co-determined by the visual traditions of the United States, Europe, and Mexico. I begin Chapter 4 with a historical detour. I'm fascinated by the story of Mariana and Antonio Coronel, the first Mexican mayor of Los Angeles under the U.S. flag. I'm also equally fascinated by his wife, Maria Williamson Coronel. They were both the first among the first Mexican-American collectors of the 19th century, that is, of the United States. And their efforts to safeguard the region's cultural history are an instructive introduction to a chapter about contemporary Chicana and Chicano art collectors, the main focus of the chapter. The Coronels were invested in cultural preservation and in notions of belonging within a context of political and social disenfranchisement. And they sought to establish a city museum to perpetuate their vision of inclusion and historical memory. Antonio Coronel and his wife witnessed the transformation of the region after the close of the U.S.-Mexico War in 1848. In some ways, they were like many other elite Mexicans in California who negotiated their status to preserve their wealth and power. They owned and managed 27 acres of fruitful land lying in the valley of the Los Angeles River on the southern outskirts of the city, and lived comfortably, first in an adobe hacienda named El Recreo. It tells you how important these people were. They had a name for their own house, right? El Recreo, built in 1834, and eventually in a Victorian manner. Deeply invested in suturing together the social fabrics of Mexico and the United States, they organized festivals to celebrate Mexican culture and independence, supported beautification projects for the city, and opened the city's first English-speaking theater in their home on July 4th, 1848. Each one of those is an underscore, right? In addition, they served as founding members of the Historical Society of Southern California in 1883. They also played a prominent role in the civic and political life, with Don Antonio holding several political offices, including the mayorship. The Coronels collected the history, art, and culture of the region for 50 years. In 1900, the widowed Mariana agreed to donate the massive trove to the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, with the understanding that when a local museum opened, it would be gifted to that institution. The collection was eventually an essential part of the nascent Los Angeles County Museum. Encompassing a variety of materials that were largely produced between 1830 and 1900, although the earliest objects go back to the 1700s, the Coronel collection evidences the complexities of borderlands experience, its contradictions and tensions, its creative responses and critical consciousness. The collection reflects the history of colonial settlers who reconciled their subordination of and injury to indigenous people through sentimentalism that attempted to salvage pieces of the culture they sought to displace and control. Several samples from the collection convey the romanticism and contradiction, as well as the critical response to disenfranchisement. For example, correspondence between the Coronels and Helen Hunt Jackson, author of the 1884 novel Ramona, reveals their sympathies for indigenous people, as well as their desire to protect Native American lands and rights through what they thought was a good idea, putting them on reservations. The Coronels also supported contemporary artists. Henry Sandom, the illustrator of Ramona, worked on commission and enjoyed the hospitality at El Recreo. Sandom produced numerous drawings and paintings of California life and acknowledged the Coronels for supplying some of our best subjects, he said. A participant in the emergent American art scene, the Canadian-born artist and illustrator created several works while staying at their home, including the portrait of a priest. The Coronels' role in fostering the visual arts in Los Angeles is most evident in the commissions they paid to a California artist, Alexander Harmer, to create paintings of the family, the landscape, and Mexican rancho life. Among these are several pastoral paintings of the couple on their property. He painted Antonio serenading Mariana in the courtyard, as you see here, Mariana making embroidery, and Mariana grinding corn, each time dressed in a different traditional, what she would label a costume. The collection also contains Harmer's photographic studies for the paintings, and his paintings were shown as part of an exhibition in California history in 1964, which situated the paintings as documentary evidence, not as aesthetic contributions. Although Harmer's paintings demonstrate the form and development of regional investment in Mexican California, they also incorporate idyllic and pastoral compositional strategies and a harmonious and soft color palette, which became the signature for California mission painters. Notably, Harmer's work and photographs of daily life on the rancho became studies for museum dioramas created in the 1930s, but the connection has never been specified for museum visitors or readers of the county museum's publications. These three-dimensional visual narratives remained a central component of the California History Hall at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County until 2012. The collection also includes works by Mariana, making her what I would say is the first documented Mexican-American artist of the 19th century. But I leave that material for another book. In my current book, I explore her relationship to her collection because I argue it's a window for understanding contemporary collectors. Perhaps the most eloquent document of her relationship to the collection is this photograph of her, of her 2 years after Don Antonio's death. It records the range of items in the collection and shows how the Coronels lived with the objects. The photograph is a long shot of 2 rooms. Items in the collection dominate both living spaces in a dense yet controlled arrangement of textiles, framed works of art, and miniatures. Paintings, lithography, and featherwork by Mexican Indians hang salon-style from the 3 visible walls. Pottery and a Victorian bell jar sits atop a small table draped with rebosos. Textiles with diamond patterns, which many would argue are typical of Southwestern aesthetics, cover the Victorian settee, and hand-woven rugs are scattered across the carpet. A small figure on a horse enclosed within a glass vase, and I think I can do it. Ooh, no, it doesn't show it very well. It's near here in the picture. Where am I? I'm a horse. In a vast case, glass case is visible at the right. It's likely a wax figure created by Mariana, who appears seated at a piano in the background, almost as if she too is on display. Certainly her presence does not upstage the collection that she and Antonio had acquired. Her demeanor is diminished, almost melancholic. Because of the composition of the photograph, it could not be mistaken for a portrait, unless it's compared to the portraits made during the 17th and 18th century of grand tours. Travelers often commission portraits of themselves along with the objects they acquired during their journey. In grand tour paintings, the travelers tend to dominate the image, reconfiguring or documenting their wealth, knowledge, and aesthetic taste. It's an ego trip, no pun intended. Mariana, in contrast, seems almost an afterthought to the photographer. In the U.S. context, her photograph is akin to Charles Wilson Peele's self-portrait, as both images document a collector among dense arrangements of objects that are presented to inspire and educate. Although several decades separate the 2 images, in both, the objects are allowed to dominate the composition. The eye shifts from the collector to the collection, back again to the collection. This chapter brings attention to the larger social implications of the private practice of collecting Chicana and Chicano art. My goal, then, is not to look at collecting practices or collectors as narcissistic hoarders with some kind of ego problem or disposable income that they don't know what to do with. And that's usually how scholarship has looked at collectors over the decades. Rather than their pseudo-psychological or psychoanalysis of collectors, I use a structural analysis based on ethnographic methods in which I place the voices of Chicana and Chicano art collectors at the forefront. Since the late 20th century, Chicana and Chicano collectors have been accumulating objects attributed to Mexican Americans in order to rescue the art and the artists from art historical and socio-political oblivion, a strategy that appears to have driven the coronals in their time. The collectors resist dominant narratives about Mexicans and Mexican Americans through a politics of reclamation. By collecting, they challenge the authority of public holdings and the discursive understanding of American art. The collection, or more precisely, the act of collecting and the occasional representation of the collection in a public exhibition, prevents the object, the self, and the community from being discarded, degraded, or rendered invisible. It claims social space in the name of community. It's a type of emplacement, I argue, or a reclamation of otherwise displaced and invisible aesthetics and people. Thus, collecting Chicana and Chicano art functions as a critical witness to the historic and ongoing institutional violence that continues to push Mexicans and Mexican Americans into marginalized social positions. I argue that Chicana and Chicano art collectors in Los Angeles embody the public emplacement of Chicana and Chicano art, offering a new map of understanding for cultural production. Their collecting practices are living corrections to the art historical record housed inside local and national institutions that claim to safeguard the aesthetic achievements of the region, of the nation, or of the world. And it's within these private collections that the archive of Chicana and Chicano art is maintained, preserved, and protected. I argue that Chicana and Chicano artists, Chicano art collectors, functions as critical witnesses to the national and international injustices of neglect. Chapter 6 is the most complex and the most controversial because I remix the exhibition record and call into question the celebratory rhetoric around particular exhibitions in Los Angeles. For example, Los Four appeared in 1974 at LACMA and has been hailed as the first Chicano art show at a mainstream museum. Well, Malcasas in Texas might dispute the claim of being the first, but my interest is actually focused on the accolades granted to LACMA. I excavate the documents that reveal that LACMA was not the ideal host. And then I also begin to wonder, what would happen to the discourse, the critical discourse, if Los Four were not the index for Chicano art, which it has been for the past several decades? And so with a new lens, one more. I have to be patient. These are big slides. They take a while to move. There we go. So with a new lens, I excavate 4 Chicano artists to see how Chicano artists participated in conceptual, abstract, and light and space aesthetics. Light and space is one of the movements very, very much grounded in Los Angeles. This particular remix allows me to reconsider Los Four and their work. And so here I focus on the catalog that was produced for the exhibition and argue that instead of seeing it as quintessentially Chicano, it's actually colorist in style and postmodern in tactics. Chicano art since the 60s concludes with an invitation to create, expand, and explore the archive even further. Unlike literary criticism, Chicano literary criticism, which can be distinguished by a variety of interpretive frameworks, such as cultural nationalist, postmodernist, post-structuralist, Marxist, feminist, queer, Gothic, you name it, scholarly work on Chicana and Chicano art has taken a much narrower approach. And therefore, in my conclusion, I sound the call for more research. I am inspired by the art itself, especially in its arrival in unexpected places. And so in the closing chapter, I devote time to 3 delightful tales about Chicano art and how they foretell the future in Los Angeles. And I'll share one with you. In December 2007, the Getty Center presented a survey exhibition of more than 30 years of photography by Mexican artist Graciela Iturbide, Goat's Dance, displayed the artist's major series of photographs. And that show included La Frontera, the series La Frontera, the series Juchitán, the series The Slaughter of Goats, and the series East LA. And that last one is called a particular attention for Chicano Los Angeles. The East LA series was originally produced for the book A Day in the Life of America, an initiative of the Kodak Corporation. Remember them? They made film and cameras. In 1986, Kodak invited 200 international artists to document the quotidian of U.S. experience. Kodak provided the film and travel expenses and required the photographers to work within the same 24-hour period, hence A Day in the Life, to capture in specific towns and cities across the country what the book identified as the typical American day. Even in 1986, such a claim was loaded with normative expectations, and the project produced a paradoxical space that both supported the status quo and embraced a new citizen subject through a large format photography book. Breaking two rules specified by Kodak, Iturbide spent 4 days taking photos rather than one, and she chose East Los Angeles, a neighborhood rather than a city or town, right? It's an unincorporated area of Los Angeles. Determined to push boundaries, she photographed a community of deaf Chicana and Chicano youth who lived in an area known as White Fence, a territory of the White Fence gang. Her ability to reach and photograph this particular community was facilitated by Chicana artist Margaret Garcia, who was asked by several parties to assist Iturbide in selecting and gaining entrance into a Chicana-Chicano community. At the time, Garcia was working at the Los Angeles Photo Center and was identified by Self-Help Graphics co-founder Sister Karen Bocalero and others as the ideal liaison for the Mexican photographer. Once Garcia agreed to help, it took 5 phone calls, she knew immediately where she would send Iturbide and to whom she would introduce the photographer. Garcia appreciated Iturbide's compassionate eye, those are her words, and she knew which she would see the youth as human beings, not as just models and subjects. Iturbide could be trusted, she said, not to reproduce the method of photojournalism. They shoot from their car, sort of like a drive-by. It was Garcia, therefore, who conceptualized a project about East Los Angeles deaf youth, whose sign as a method of communication and not simply as gang affiliation. She negotiated introductions for Iturbide and implicitly supported the photographer's exploration of the White Fence gang and their Chicano community for the Kodak project. The portraits by Iturbide express her unique photographic eye through their high contrast and intense compositional focus, and they struck a chord with Los Angeles Chicano residents. Even without knowing Garcia's role in the project, audiences appear to have understood the transnational triangulation that connected the Mexican photographer, the Chicana artist, and a Chicano neighborhood. Facilitating the transnational visual exchange were photographs that included well-known murals in East Los Angeles. Although the murals were backdrops to Iturbide's iconic portraits of the White Fence members, a major contingent of visitors to the Getty Center viewed the murals not as backdrop, not as background, but as subject. Indeed, during the exhibition, audiences familiar with Chicano art and culture congregated around the photographs that included the murals and community landmarks. So returning to the galleries, day after day after day, I witnessed a particular energy in the room. As I listened to visitors conversing in Chicano English, Spanglish, and Spanish, it became apparent from the perspectives of these men and women and their children who announced their Chicano identification of East Los Angeles by recognizing its landmarks, the exhibition was not simply the work of a Mexican photographer. It was a display of Chicano art. Chicana and Chicano museum goers congregated in the galleries presenting the series East LA, commenting, debating the images. They created headaches for the docents and the security guards by gesturing and looking too closely at the photographs. These viewers not only shifted their bodies in ways that signaled a breach of protocol to museum security, they also shifted the perspective that had been conceived by the curator and the museum. They came to witness Chicano art. Give it a minute. There we go. Cholos Harpies East LA is like a mural composition that captures the photos of 4 young men as they raise their hands above their heads, making ambiguous gestures that fall between American Sign Language and the street signals of gang affiliation. The shadows hug the walls in the same linear configuration and composition frequently used in early Chicano murals. Another photograph showed a young man with the image, a mural of Guadalupe at his back, reminding visitors of a composition that they were very familiar with, tattoos on men's back to protect themselves in prison. Visitors to the exhibition consistently celebrated these works and the murals. Several of the images on display portrayed white fence visitors positioned in front of murals, and this next one particularly documents that remixing that I suggest. Not only does it mimic mural figuration, but Iturbide strategically places residents of East Los Angeles within the mural composition. The photograph depicts a group of men and women and one child in a tight cluster, arms interlocking, hands joining in sign. And Iturbide tricks the eye. What appears to be a group of 7 is in reality a group of 5 standing in front of a mural. This photograph was the focus of intense discussion and visual scrutiny. Visitors challenged each other to identify the artifice. And I watched in pleasure as they discovered that the 2 men in the back were painted figures. With the help of Margaret Garcia, Graciela Iturbide smuggled Chicano art into the Getty. The triangulation that linked the Mexican photographer, a Chicana artist, and East LA murals produced a relationship that reminded me of the times that I was happy at Disneyland. You know those days when Disneyland closed the doors and it was only for Dodgers fans or Bank of America employees? There was a special moment when we became the center of object and subject at the Getty. And so I end my discussion in the book with Chicano Day at the Museum, what I call Chicano Day at the Museum. It's those affective moments where the population itself changes the narrative that we all know so well of exclusion, and we become the members at the center. What I argue in these last pages is in that moment of triangulation, the Getty may not see the work as art, as Chicano art, but they eventually will have to catch up with the demographic profile of a city that is overwhelmingly Chicano. Thank you.
And we did reserve approximately 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A if anybody wants to engage the professor for her presentation.
Yeah, I was worried about time, so I wanted to make sure you had time for questions, so I hurried that end part.
Right.
You can ask me about the work. You can ask me about all the students I worked with. Oh, my God. Okay. Well, let me start with Sitlali, who you know at the library. She's amazing. So Lalo Alcaraz helped me organize all the transcripts, and so before I went out on an interview, I had to create like a basic bio so I knew what was happening when in their life, and then matching that biographic history with what was happening in the country. For example, most of these artists were living, were old enough to remember Kennedy's assassination, and so I'd ask them, where were you on Kennedy, the day Kennedy was assassinated? So I had certain trigger questions that were based on like a timeline of their life, and he created that timeline, and then he kept me on target when my meetings were, when my appointments were, and then where my transcripts were in the process, because the transcription process was equally intense. So instead of just taking a transcript and putting it up on the internet for the world to use, the artist wanted to make sure that we got the record straight. So I had to go through the transcript page by page and approving every word with them. So in addition to these on average 10-hour interviews that were over many days, I also did several days of going through what ended up being like a 500-page book. And we wanted to do that because we knew that some artists never approved the transcripts that the Smithsonian had created, and we didn't want to run into that. And we also wanted them to feel good about the final project. And so all but 2 are actually online at UCLA. So let's see. Adon Duarte did library research. Jackie Estrada is still here. She helped me, just looking up. Araceli and Jackie would run to the library, and I'd say, I need to pin down this exhibition, or who said X, and I know it's in such and such catalog. Find it, find the page number, hand it to me, and they'd do that. I don't know how they did that. I gave them basic. Frank did a lot of, and so did Nick, proofreading the final document, or what I thought at the time was the final document. These are 2 amazing students, excellent writing skills, and I said, you need to tell me if I misplace a modifier. So my students in the audience, that's my weakness. I misplace modifiers in my writing, and I do it over and over again. I cannot figure out, I think it's a dyslexic thing. I can't get the order right. So that's why I can see it in yours, because I've had so many people tell me that I'm doing it. So now they all know the secret. And they helped me do that. Lorena, I think, did some early transcription, and then I sent it out. I was like, this is ridiculous. UCLA said, yeah, let's send it out. But she also helped me do corrections. Like there's a school of thought for transcription. I am not the expert to ask, but one of these transcribers would send us things that are verbatim, and artists don't want to see their words like that. They want it edited so it looks smart. All of us speak, interrupting ourselves, starting and stopping, sentences aren't complete, stuttering, all those things are normal. But artists did not want to see that. And Lorena helped cleaned up, because even though it was professionally transcribed, that's not what that person's skill was. And so Lorena helped clean those up. God, Heidi, I think she did the same thing. But Heidi was also a really good writer, so I think she helped me put things together for proposals at an early stage. Yeah. They were amazing. They're amazing. Yeah. And they'll be in the book. I want to make sure that's clear. They'll be in the front acknowledgments in the book, as well as my library and technical support. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Early on in your presentation, you said that scholars were not keeping up with artists. And I was just, I love that phrase, and I was just wondering if you can just say a little bit more about that. Where are Chicana artists going? What are they doing? Can you say a little bit more about that?
So Chicano art history has this bifurcating methodology, this dual approach. It's either political or it's commercial. That was like the first wave. And then the second wave, oh, it's feminist. And then some people would say that's not really Chicano. Or they'd say it's personal and it's political. Or it's conceptual and it's political. There was always this either or. Artists have been doing lots of things all the time. So some of the books that came out will say, oh, after the 80s, you'll see more conceptual, more abstract. No, no, no. Artists were doing that in the 60s during the movement. So my next project, Chicana, Chicano art with an X, so I can indicate indigeneity. I'm not talking just about Chicano movement artists. I can do everything. Since 1848, the moment at which we become legally Mexican Americans, hopes to be a comprehensive, multi-volume approach so that we can say, where have we been, where are we going? Because I don't think we know that yet. This is just 50 years LA art. We're not there yet. And in African American studies, in Asian American studies, we actually have much more scholarship than we do in Chicano art history. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Professor. So Self-Help Graphics is in the house,
Yeah.
and thank you so much. You were so instrumental in getting them to come over to the west side for today's event.
An hour and a half commute.
Long drive,
Hour and a half.
exactly. So how did you first establish contact with them, and how did that relationship develop over the years? How did that begin?
Well, the truth is, the project started in 2003 with my first sabbatical. My first sabbatical in 2003, 2004. I was studying what I called at the time museum culture, and I was going to look at the 5 things museums do: exhibition, collection, preservation, interpretation, and education around Chicano art. And so I did a couple of interviews, and they all fell flat, because I was focusing on those 5 topics and not on what the artist's own organic concepts were. So since 2003, I've been going to a lot of art exhibits, like every weekend. That's how they came to know me. I'd show up. And that has paid off, because they tell me that. They say, oh, yeah, you're there. Yeah. So once I did that and I had gathered this information, did I write anything from that sabbatical? I don't think I even wrote anything from that sabbatical. I was trying to put, oh yeah, I think I did the collecting section. I did stuff on collecting. So when I got the opportunity to do the interviews in 2007, and UCLA actually bought out my time so I could do interviews with artists in fall of 2007, I just called up the first 3 people I knew would say yes, which is always a really good strategy. Monica Palacios, who used to teach here, Linda Vallejo, who was my third? I think it was Richard Duardo. No, it was Barbara Carrasco. Barbara Carrasco. And then every person I said, can you recommend? It's called the snowball effect. And they all, and it just, the word got out. And then people would call me, you've got to interview so-and-so. He's 83 years old, you've got to interview so-and-so. We had funding to interview 30 artists, and being an egomaniac, I said, I can do 30 artists from August to December. I barely got 10 done in that time period because they wanted to keep talking. So that became the signature of, what I added to the other scholars on the project did not produce. They produced what the budget said they would, 3 to 4 hours. You can't produce a life history interview. It's a life history interview. What is your earliest memory? That's my first question. So, yeah. And every artist should do at least 3 life history interviews in their lifetime, at least 3. So 1 now, 1 in 10 years, and then 1 in another 15, at least 3. So, yeah, my signature was that they kept talking. And the secret is being a good listener. A lot of that. A lot of active listening. That is it. That's all I did. I'm telling you, that's all I did.
We have time for one more question.
A student. Yeah. She gets extra points for that, you know. I make my other students want to ask questions.
Did you have a favorite artist that you interviewed, or one that was most like memorable to you?
I can't say if I have a favorite artist because then the other artists won't talk to me. But I can tell you
Well, that was
that
very
Johnny Gonzalez, 27-hour interview. Every weekend in November and December, 4 hours at a time. Usually we have what's called interview fatigue, around 2 hours. Both the interviewer and the interviewee get tired. This man, I'd give him lunch, and he'd come back for more, and I'd be like, I had to drink coffee, and I don't do that kind of drug. I had to drink coffee because he just, and guess how old he is? You know, Johnny, he's in his 70s, late 70s. He's in his late 70s, and he was just like, I make it sound like that's really old, you know, just 2 decades away. But I could never anticipate. I could not anticipate a man of his age having that much energy. It was amazing. It was amazing. And the reason we kept going, we broke the bank on the budget, because he was active. He was in Goez. He was a founder of Goez. He was one of the first producers of Chicano film in this city. Yeah. And he was a graphic artist who made connections with, you name it, Dewar's whiskey or whatever, 7-Up, Coca-Cola. He got stuff done. Yeah.
All right, and with that, can everybody please help me thank Dr. Karen Mary Davalos for tonight? I also wanted to say thank you to the self-help graphic artists who are sitting in the back. Martha and Dewey, thank you so much for coming out today. And thank you to my library outreach teammates, Carol, Matt, and John. Thank you very much. And finally, thanks to each of you for coming out for tonight. If you do have those feedback forms to turn in, again, that plastic box is over here. And there is a bit of drink and food left in case you want to hang around and mingle around. We have the room until 7 o'clock, right? So thank you once again.